we are going to follow the money.
Everything you need to know can be understood with this simple phrase: follow the money. And believe me, that's what's happened.
Here comes the money.
Here we go. Money talk.
Here comes the money.
Welcome to College Sports Follow the Money, an all-new podcast diving into the critical issues surrounding the big business of college sports. I'm Andrew Monaco, joined by former president of Texas A&M University and former chancellor at the University of Missouri, Dr. R. Bowen Lofton, and former vice president and general manager of Fox Sports Southwest, John Heike. From NIL to the transfer portal and opt-outs to the college football playoff, conference realignment, and more, we tackle the key issues facing college athletics today and into the future.
I need to feel you, Jerry! Show me the money! Jerry, you better yell! Show me the money! Show me the money! You loudest black man!
Howdy, and welcome to Follow the Money. This is episode number 49, along with Dr. R. Bowen Lofton, former president at Texas A&M and chancellor at Missouri, and with John Heike, former vice president and general manager at Fox Sports Southwest. I'm Andrew Monaco. Now, I'm going to date myself right here. I don't know if this is going to be like Bewitched, when we went from one Darren to the other and no one said anything. But this is the big secret John had. I'm the new host, everybody.
Yay!
Thank you so much for having me, guys. I'm really proud to be working alongside you.
Well, we're excited to have you, Andrew. Go ahead, Doctor.
No, glad to have you on board, Andrew. You are the voice of many. We appreciate you being the voice of us as well.
Yeah, Andrew and I go way back too, and so this is a personal fun for me to be able to collaborate with him in some. I think will be educational to our fan base. I think Andrew's going to bring a lot to the table. We're going to miss Gabe, never can replace him, but we do think we are so fortunate to have Andrew stepping in and being part and parcel of this process as well.
I hope I have half the passion that Gabe has. If I have that, I think I'm going to be on the right track. That's for sure. For me, it's approaching almost 40 years in this business. And when I talk about that in the broadcasting business, so I've seen everything go from analog to digital, to SD to HD to Ultra 4K, 8K, and all of that. So for me, the business side of sports, the money side of sports, from going from the rights to a cable company to back in-house, John Heike, we're talking about teams taking their broadcasts back in-house. We're talking about possibly conferences going to streaming services. It used to be, over the air to cable. That was a big thing. Now we add streaming. Sometimes we just repackage things, but it's always ever changing throughout the landscape of broadcasting, is it not?
It is. It almost seems like Back to the Future today when you talk about where broadcast television now is seemingly kind of left for dead on the road when it came to media rights, and how valuable it is now to the overall networks, what live sports continues to do. And now that's trickling down to the regional level because of cord cutting and other issues that are taking away viewers and dollars from the regional sports network business. The teams are now kind of looking at how do we make up for that revenue and how do we continue to grow our fan base. And they don't have all the answers yet either, but I think it's going to be a fascinating time as they navigate these waters going forward.
Dr. Lofton, one thing that jumps up is there's no longer going to be an SEC on CBS, and no one knows that deal better than you do. Ross Dellinger of Sports Illustrated has the article. It's now all with ESPN, and I did learn there's going to be more ABC windows. But what a deal for CBS at the time, and we almost have to rewind. It kind of took a little bit of a gamble. The SEC wasn't the SEC. But they weren't going to budge. They were going to hold this contract until the very end. And as you know, adding Missouri and Texas A&M added a little more intrigue to that deal.
Well, it did, Andrew. Oddly, we had at almost every SEC board comprised of the chancellors and presidents of all the schools, this came up. The CBS contract had many issues with it. One of which was value. I mean, was it valuable enough? Did it deal with the content offered by the SEC at the right level of financial support? And the other issue was this 2-week window that you had when CBS could call who they would have as the game of the week. And so we were all waiting for that to get our game scheduled, wherever they were going to be shown at the time. And now it's hopefully going to be in a little bit easier situation here. But we have this history of 2-week window. We have a history of CBS basically saying we're a good deal, whether you believe it or not. And they weren't the best deal at the end of the day. And it took a while. I was long gone from the SEC board by the time they made the decision. But I know it came up very regularly at our meetings about this contract with CBS and weighing the historical value of it versus the real value of it in today's dollars was a really critical issue for the board.
It was $55 million at the time through this season. Their last game on the SEC will be in Atlanta, the SEC championship. John, when it went up for bid, the first thing I thought of was, you don't get the first bid. Shouldn't you always get the last bid when you have a deal?
Yeah, normally in these rights deals, the incumbent always has some type of clause in there called under the back end rights variety that allow them to have the one final bite at the apple. So they may have had that, and I think they may have passed on it because I think, again, it just at that point in time when this deal was negotiated, I think it went up almost 5 times. And so I think CBS was going through some structural changes there too in terms of their stock price where they wanted to be. So I think it was a challenging, economic decision for them at the time. And so that probably all weighed heavily into them probably saying, passing. But I think I would have been surprised if they didn't have a right to match that offer at the end of the day.
Looking back, I thought originally that this was going to be 1992 all over again when they lost the NFC to Fox. But they've got the Big Ten to fall back on, which kind of softens the blow. And then they scrambled to get the AFC back in the latter 90s and probably overpaid. It was great for every NFL team, but they've got the Big Ten to fall back on. What's going to be different is that exclusive window. What's going to be different is, the 75 member crew that all traveled together, as big a crew as their number one game on Sunday. And I think second only to their championship and Super Bowl crews. That's what's going to be a little bit of an adjustment, I would think.
Yeah, I think the other thing too, Andrew, you talked about it was that CBS window had been the top rated game basically year in, year out for all of college football. So Fox now with their big noon, what ESPN's doing in prime time, and again, switching for them to the Big Ten, and now the ESPN being able to move SEC games into other competitive windows. It'll be interesting to see if CBS will still have that level of dominant viewership in that 2:30 window.
A lot of games on ESPN, and as I mentioned, it's also ABC. That's what my understanding is. More games are moving to ABC. John, my question to you, was it because ESPN wanted so much on their cable platform? To me, this is my thought. ABC started sports programming under Roone Arledge. To see ESPN on ABC was a tad of an insult to me because there was so much history. If this were Fox or something like that, I could see where it's new. But they've almost rediscovered over the air all over again, where obviously the ratings are going to be good. And it's got to be better because now more people can see this product.
Yeah, I think you're right, Andrew. And another economic point in there too, that now that in the broadcast business, it's again, we're probably getting a little granular for our listeners and viewers. But again, there is retransmission consent fees now that the broadcast stations are able to extract from their cable distributors as well. And having live sports and ESPN and ABC having the ability to kind of move those games around to best put them in the best financial position has certainly helped in this process as well. So I think, again, that's helped. Live sports is basically what's keeping the legacy broadcast industry in business today. So again, I think as time will happen, you will probably see more marquee events probably migrate to the network or the national network brands, but still you'll have plenty of content to put on your cable channels as well. But I think, again, the big games are going to probably end up on the broadcast channels when this is all said and done.
Dr. Lofton, did they really balk at more money for Missouri and Texas A&M when they came in? When, to me, it's not just the schools, but also the markets that they brought in. But you were talking about CBS was balking and wasn't going to increase anything.
Yes, that's exactly right. When I began attending SEC board meetings before we actually joined, our official join date at Texas A&M and Missouri both was July 1, 2012. And almost a year before that, the commissioner, Mike Slive, began to include me and Brady Deaton Missouri in the meetings, not as non-voters, just to be getting us integrated with the team, basically. And again, CBS's conversation was interesting. Mike went to them, as you might expect, saying, "Hey, we're adding 2 marquee schools to our repertoire here in the SEC. Let's up the ante here." And basically, CBS says, "We have a contract." And the contract didn't spell out specifically that additional teams in the conference would mean additional money. That was not physically in the contract, as I recall. And so CBS basically just, as you said, balked. They said, "We got a contract, we're going to do it." As this contract evolved over time, we came back to it from time to time. It got a little richer ultimately through the renegotiation, but it wasn't immediate at all. And that was a sticking point for some of us. And again, I'll just come back to that. Their exclusive claim to deciding who was going to play drove everything. Every decision about who was going to be shown where waited on CBS. And that got tiresome, as you might expect.
So now schools will be able to, I don't want to say dictate times, but have the assignments and know them sooner going forward?
I think so in a way. I think the conference is going to take more of a leadership role here and say, here's how we're going to make our decisions here. Clearly, and John can confirm this, clearly the TV networks and the other broadcasters and media companies make a decision based on the content they have access to, make a decision on where to put it in terms of time because of the teams. I mean, who's number 1, who's number 10, who's number 15, who's playing who, and what audience will we get? The calculation, I think, John, is very clear. How many viewers will we have for a particular matchup? When? And so you put your best matchups where you get the most bang for the buck in advertising revenue. And, John can comment on this directly, but I believe that's the driver right now. The issue is who makes the decision when? And I believe now, well, I can't prove this, that the conferences, those commissioners will make a very real effort to begin to control the decision-making timeline for who plays who. We know who plays who, but who plays who at what time window during that particular day. John, can you react to that?
Yeah, I think one of the thing for it's going to benefit ESPN and to a lesser degree the SEC is going to be, again, now they're all on the same page when it comes to how they want to schedule games. I mean, CBS had one strategy that they wanted to use, then ESPN had to work around it, the schools had to work around it. Now, all of them are in line, if you will, for trying to make sure that these games draw the biggest audience because it behooves both the conference and the networks to try to maximize their revenue opportunities. And so I think, again, you'll see, they'll be able to develop some more continuity and flow in their programming from one game leading into another, from storylines. So as they put their schedules together for the rest of the year, sometimes what you had to do is make sure if you were in the Big 10 or the Big 12, for instance, and you had 2 partners and they kind of alternated picks, you had to make sure as a conference scheduler, you had 2, marquee television games each week. And so that kind of maybe dictated how you would schedule some things to try to move games around. So I think in this particular scenario, the winners are going to be probably fans of the SEC through the promotional capabilities and programming capabilities of how ESPN and ABC are going to work hand in hand to try to, again, create greater flow and viewership translating from one game to the next and from a week-to-week standpoint as well.
Was one of the concessions, Dr. Lofton, the 2:30 window, that was exclusive there for a while. Did CBS ease up on that a little bit as the contract went on?
Well, we kind of forced that on them. That we basically said, look, if you want to have your cake and eat it too, you can't do it. You can't control everything and also keep the price where you have it right now. So the negotiations, I recall it, was based on how we set the price point for the contract versus their exclusivity in terms of the window itself. And so that was sort of the only real negotiating power the SEC had at that point, was to say, look, you want this time period here, get it, you're going to have to give us more money. And that eventually came about, not the level they got from other sources like the SEC network, for example, but it was still a little richer pie as time went on.
John, is $55 million a year for the SEC one of the best deals in television?
That may have been one of the best deals in television for that time period. Absolutely. What they got for those last 5 years of that agreement. And again, most when you do broadcast agreements, it historically is the team or league gets the benefit up front because they're getting a significant increase with their prior deal. But as the deal goes on in length, then it kind of the shift favors over to the broadcast side of it, so they can recoup some of that money that they've spent. But I think in CBS's case, they were really able to recoup these last 5 years. I think if you look at their economics versus what the rights fee were, that would be a tremendous return on investment.
Yes.
There are a lot of people are going to be surprised when they hear that music on the Big Ten now.
That's true.
Yeah. And I think they're going to keep the music, right? I read that somewhere, right? They're going to keep
that
same theme. Yeah. So that will be interesting.
That's from the 80s. So when the CFA, when that came, and there's a lot of acronyms, by the way, and we're going to get to one in a little bit called NIL, and it's going to be nowhere near 55 million. But that music, look, you're going back to when Gary Bender was still doing games, Jim Nantz was doing games, when no longer was there that monopoly. Oklahoma was part of that, breaking that up. That the CFA comes in, and but I mean that music goes back to 87, and yet it's so identifiable. But that's how big the SEC got on CBS around the nation, that you identify that music from a composer in New York City that knows nothing about Kyle Field or anything like that. But that's how identifiable that has been. But now that, again, that goes with CBS. But there's going to be some people, I had Brad Nessler on my podcast, and we were talking about it. And I asked Vern Lundquist the same question. Do you get jazzed when you hear that music? And I don't know how you could not. You knew that it was going to be the biggest game of the weekend was coming on in just a little bit.
Yeah, music is such an important part of the production. As you know, it's such a strong emotional feeling that when you hear those tunes. And I think if you look back at Monday Night Football, for instance, that iconic soundtrack forever, Fox, what they did with the Fox NFL Sunday, even now what College Game Day is doing with their music to open the show, NBC, Carrie Underwood, how they're trying to create that. So music is such a big part of getting that emotion and getting that build up because of the sport. And again, those things go very hand in hand. And I think, again, that's an important part. And again, when you hear that sound, you know who it is. And so that, again, helps build that emotional connection to that network.
Dr. Lofton, you were talking about a big thing. I'm going to go from 55 million to 4.2 billion with a B. That's a big thing.
Now, my old friend, Judge Claudia Wilkin, is back in the news again. Probably people have already heard a bit about this, but there's been a case bouncing around in her court for a while. By the way, she is sitting in Oakland, California, a bastion of conservatism, as we all know. And so she made a decision years ago regarding the O'Bannon case and a parallel case that led to NIL becoming legal back when this podcast began. We began this podcast just as that happened, basically. But she was the ruling judge back in that time. Now she's back in the news again. A gentleman named Grant House approached the lawsuit process here a while back, joined by two other players, one from Oregon, a basketball player, and one from Illinois, a football player, saying, we've been cheated. We used to play college sports. We never got a chance to do NIL during our time frame. We want our share of the pie. And so they filed a lawsuit in her court, and that was very strategically picked. I mean, they picked a court they knew would be friendly to them. And what really makes this interesting is just this week, she declared this to be a class action suit. So it got certified for class action. So originally this was a lawsuit by three former student athletes coming saying, we want our share of what we would have gotten had NIL been in play while we played, okay? And that would have been modest. Idiots at NCAA should have settled. They should have gone right away to those people as plaintiffs and said, let's settle this case. But no, they didn't do that. They waited. And then their lawyers got interested in making this into a bigger deal for themselves. And so they went to the judge, who they knew to be friendly, saying, let's make this a class action suit. So it went to 1.2 billion from what could have been a few million at most for these plaintiffs to be given if they settled it, but they didn't. But the other thing about this is the antitrust law situation in which this is being actually prosecuted by the courts and by these plaintiffs has a triple damage situation. So they're asking for 1.2 billion, but because of the class action nature and the antitrust laws involved, They're going to get 3 times that if this goes all the way through the process. The trial is set for January 2025, so we won't get an immediate answer out of this, but I can predict the outcome. I can predict the outcome that Judge Wilkins is going to find for the plaintiffs. That's been her history for a while. It's going to be appealed. Her appellate record is not perfect. She's been knocked down a couple of notches when these cases went to the Court of Appeals. And it got not changed totally, but some things got moved around a bit. That may happen again. But nonetheless, this may well be the death knell for the NCAA. Their assets, I believe, are probably around $500 million right now. If you have a $4.2 billion judgment against them that's sustained an appeal, that wipes out the NCAA. The problem is, besides them being named as the lead defendant, there are the other conferences here. And so conceivably, this trickles down to costs associated with each conference, especially the Power Five. And so I worry about that going forward. Again, just like O'Bannon, if they just settled the thing, if the NCAA had gone and settled it right away, it might not have stopped it forever, but it would have slowed the process down a lot, and it would have been a lot more, I guess, amenable for them to go through a more measured, very lengthy process to move us into this NIL world than rather abrupt when we went through here because of their decision to not settle and to prosecute very poorly, by the way, their case. They didn't do a good job. If you look at the actual records of the transcripts, I've read some of those. They really made several mistakes strategically in going through this that cost them the judgment, even though the judge probably would have gone where she went anyway. They made it easier for her to do that. And the appellate courts, again, largely kept Wilkins' decision intact, although there were a few pieces of it that didn't get through the process. But this will happen all over again. And by the way, there are at least a half a dozen other cases pending right now that have similar flavors to them. There is the National Labor Relations Board complaints. Number of athletes have filed complaints with that board, demanding they be allowed to be covered by the Fair Labor Act, that they be allowed to unionize. That's all in play, both in courts and out of courts. The board I'm talking about here is dominated by Democrats right now. It's going to definitely be a situation where that board is pro-union, and I could see unionization moving quickly. So who gets it? Does the UAW get to represent athletes, or who's going to do that for us anyway? So we're entering very quickly, I think, an era where the athletes are going to be in control largely. That's a real issue because 18, 19, 20-year-olds aren't always going to be the most experienced people to go through these processes. And it, I think, definitely leads to the NCAA going away. How it actually affects the individual conferences is to be determined, but it will be, I think, a major impact on all of us ultimately.
The inability when NIL came out, there was no broad umbrella, if you will. So the states kind of forced the issue. Here's my thought. Anytime you want to ask Congress to do something, I'm not sure that's going to be the best way to do it. But the NCAA kind of brings this on itself, does it not, by its inactivity on NIL?
No, it could have easily have managed this by arranging to settle the key cases, the two key cases involved here, both heard by Wilkin, by the way. Those cases could have been settled out of court in a way that minimized the cost of NCAA, but also set the stage for a very reasoned way for us to go forward in terms of the national impact of all this. And the NCAA was absent. They just simply did not pick up on that. And I hold, not so much the current president, but the previous president, the NCAA, very accountable for this. I think he let this happen. He was in charge. He was a CEO, and he let this happen in a way that anybody with half a brain could have told him was going to be bad for them and bad for the college sports in general. But they simply did not go down the right pathway here.
And Dr. Lofton, the class action changed everything too, didn't it?
Oh, that causes all kinds of issues in terms of the multiplying damages, but it also creates a much more favorable environment in which this can be heard as a trial. I mean, this will be likely a judge decided case. Okay. And she has a record already, very clear record. She's been through an appellate process several times, these kinds of cases. So she kind of knows how to thread the needle too. So no judge wants to be overruled by an appellate court. That's not what you want to get done as a judge. So she's going to not only come at this with a preconception, I think, of how this should come out. And that's just my opinion only, but that's where I think in her mind. But she's going to know how the appellate courts will look at this also. And she'll be very careful to structure her decision in a way to minimize the opportunity for appeals to be won by, in this case, the defendant, NCAA. And again, even though the conferences are drawn into this, guess who is the lead defendant? It's the NCAA. And their record is so far pretty poor in terms of strategically dealing with these kinds of issues in a way that minimizes the impact on the sport while really helping the student athletes appropriately. I'm not against NIL. I'm not against athletes being able to cash in through their hard work on some of the benefits of being in college sports. But if it destroys the entire enterprise of college sports in the process, I got a problem with that.
Not just, this could be football taking away every other student athlete's opportunity, correct?
Well, football is the driver. I mean, that's where the money is.
Absolutely.
Men's basketball can make it work. If you get to the tournament enough, your shares there are going to be enough to give you some reasonable income. So there's only two sports that have a net income. That's football and oftentimes men's basketball. Everything else, with a few minor exceptions, is going to lose money. I mean, you can have a baseball team that has the right exact situation with their revenue and expenses to make some money, but that's fairly rare. So every sport depends on this. If you crater football, the ripple effects are going to be huge throughout all of college sports. And again, we represent, those three of us here, fairly rich schools. But there's a pile of schools out there without these kinds of resources, and they're going to be very hard pressed. So where do you draw the line? Is it just the bowl teams in Division I? Is it all Division I? How far do you go down this pathway here and make this applicable to a given team? You realize that the majority of sports programs at the college level are not funded by TV revenue. They're funded by student fees. So in the smaller schools, in the group of five and on down the list, it's the fees the kids pay that pay the bills for the coaching salaries and those kinds of things. The revenue from TV is not enough, from ticket sales, sponsorships, not enough. So that's where the money comes from. I, in the 1960s, as an Aggie student, paid a fee to help build the second deck on the east side of Kyle Field. I helped pay for that, okay? and that's just how it used to be. And the Power Five is blessed. To my knowledge, only one school in the Power Five doesn't have a net revenue number, and that's Vanderbilt. And that we don't know why that is. I mean, they get the same revenue from the conference that A&M and other SEC schools get, but they don't have the attendance or the sponsorships at their small stadium to be able to overcome that. And so they subsidize sports. But the only Power Five school I know that subsidizes sports right now. But in group of five, that's where you begin to see it. And you go below that and you see it totally subsidized. And unfortunately, the students do pay those bills.
The last time we heard about damages being trebled was the USFL, and that was from $1 to $3, right?
Yes. It's been a while.
It's fascinating. John, it's fascinating because, we go from seeing the Pac-12 become the Pac-2, right? And all that. You knew a seismic change was happening, but I didn't realize it was going to be small fissures along the line. It wasn't going to be like, my thought was, when the television contracts are done, that's where we might see a super Division I. It's really these small fissures along the way that is leading to quite the change in college athletics.
Yeah, and I think, again, as we've talked on the podcast and prior episodes too, it's not over. There's still other going to be shifts coming in this space, and I think, again, all of these different factors, between legal factors, between congressional factors, between media factors that are driving these. All these are going to play a part in. And one of the things that's hurting the NCAA right now, just the sport and collegiate athletics in general, is again not having clear leadership that's looking out for the best interest of all the particular parties in these conversations. So we're seeing something again. The Big Ten's trying to figure out what to do with Jim Harbaugh right now. In terms of that the accusations that have been made against that program. At the end of the day, do you think they really want to penalize Michigan and take them out of the CFP contention when they may be the champion and the additional revenue that could bring to you, as a conference? So, again, I think the fans who of this are starting to see these things too and realizing. I said, hey, what I grew up and what I watched is changing right before my eyes. And again, how does the industry as a whole trying to correct some of these negative trends and get back to a point where, again, was it ever completely great? Probably not, but it certainly was better than what we're looking at. And how do we try to repair some of those fissures and get the sport back to where there is some, again, and as we look toward the futures, how do we try to build a model that's going to work for everybody? Certainly reward the teams that are putting the most effort into it. But again, how do we keep the UTSAs and some of these smaller schools in play as well? Because again, to Dr. Slofton's point, I just saw student fees in San Antonio. The students voted down an increase that was going to go to their student fees to help support some of their athletic programs. So, I think again, if you leave it up to the students to vote, I think again, you're seeing what UTSA did. You'll probably see more of those situations. And again, the sad part is there seems to be enough money to go around. It's just, again, how do we make sure that it's getting divvied up appropriately where, again, it's benefiting all versus a few?
The phrase that keeps coming to my mind is unintended consequences. And that's whether it's NIL or transfer portal, two of the biggest things in the NCAA right now.
Very much so. The portal has had its own impact, not quite as obvious to some as NIL has, but it's there. And it's not always positive. I mean, a lot of students got stuck in the portal when they try to move on. It's hard when you're 19 years old and you're fairly successful athletically not to have a high opinion of yourself. But sometimes your opinion is not justified and not based in reality. And you go out in the marketplace and all of a sudden, nobody wants me. That's not a good thing. So you cut your ties to where you had support. All of a sudden, you're without any anchor. And you're floating around in a sea where there's no money for you at all. And that's a very debilitating thing for an athlete to go through, in my opinion. I never had that problem. Nobody wanted me anyway. But again, if I'm an athlete who has some success at high school, maybe early college, I overinflate in my own mind what I'm worth. And I tell my coach I'm gone. And then that's the end of that little tie. And all of a sudden, I look around and there's nobody there throwing me a lifeline. And that's a real problem. And again, the other issue is simply how you manage this as a coach. I think we all realize that some coaches have been quite successful at managing the portal. I can name a certain women's basketball coach in Louisiana who has done a very good job of doing that. She built a team from nothing and got a national championship 2 years later, okay? That's one example of that. Others don't play the game. And that is a loss to their school, their team, their sport, because they aren't playing the game appropriately. And I'm not advocating necessarily the game is a good game, but it's there and you got to deal with it. And the best coaches figure it out. And the best schools have figured out how to add staffing specifically to manage their portal issues. And if you don't do that well, guess what? You're the loser.
First thing I thought of is college needs a department, the pro player personnel. It's not pro, but you need a personnel department now. And that's more money. That makes that staff even larger. So going back to the schools that are handcuffed anyway, how do they grow to get these players to make their program better? Sometimes it's a vicious cycle as well.
Well, it is. And what's going to happen here is you have to have people involved. They're called lawyers. And so the player has to have an agent and a lawyer on their side. And there are sports lawyers who specifically specialize right now in crafting NIL and portal situations for their clients. And you've got to have a staff on your team as well. Guess what? That all costs money. Lawyers aren't cheap. They're pretty expensive people. And when you're paying $300, $405 an hour for this attorney to come in there and help you, both the school has to have it and the student athlete has to have it. So you're going to have an issue here with just how many people you have to add into the mix to make all this stuff work. Who gets rich? Yeah, I can tell you who gets rich.
John, does this mean you have to add another class to your sport management? Because this is just fascinating, right?
Yeah, I'm having a conversation on that with a colleague of mine, and it says at the collegiate level, and we're using football for an example. To your point, you almost need to now really develop the model at the collegiate level is broken right now compared to what it used to be versus how do you manage all these different changes. And if you look at the NFL model, to your point, you do have a director of player personnel. You have a guy managing the salary cap. In this case, it could be NIL. You got a guy managing the portal. You got a guy managing the high school recruiting. You know, all of these things come into play. And if you look at the NFL model too, is at the end of the day, it's the coordinators that get all the, that are really, running the things on the field, and everything else is going off the field. So how does the college game adapt to this space? And Dr. Lofton hit it on the head. Some coaches are going to do a better job than others. And they're going to be coaches who kind of, that we've probably grown up with, who are going to look at this and say, is this the world that I signed up for? And it'll be interesting to see kind of the churn, if you will, what happens here going forward too in this process.
John, do you think that's going to be the older coaches that will struggle? Yeah,
I would think so, again, because they've grown up in one way doing it, and all of a sudden now the rules are changing, and the goal lines are being moved right before their eyes. And how do they manage that? The younger guys say, if that's the rules, let's all play it, let's go. But I do think some of the guys that have been in the league for a few years and have developed a routine or developed a system that they think works are going to be challenged in this process.
Okay, since I'm the new guy, is there anything I'm missing this week, and what can I do better next week?
Let me add one thing, if I could, Andrew. It's a little news item off the side here, very different news item here, but it's about money, guys. A survey was done of all the Power 5 schools, asking them, do you publicly sell alcoholic beverages in your stadium? 80% said yes. Of those that didn't say yes, the majority of those have it available in suites, private clubs, things like that within their stadium, okay? Others who say no to alcohol, like Wisconsin, are beginning to do it in basketball. Football is not as dry, basketball and hockey are not. Funny about that. So my point is, once again, money is here. The SEC had a rule until a few years ago that said no alcoholic beverage sales in our sporting venues, except when they're controlled through suites or private clubs. That went away 2019, I think. And very quickly, all the SEC schools began selling alcohol in their stadiums here, generally to the public. That's happening widely throughout the entire sporting world right now because guess what? It's a revenue stream. Anybody who's bought a beer up at AT&T Stadium knows how much that can cost. and so the revenue from beverages can be a significant fraction in a place like a major stadium, like the one up in Arlington, Texas. And guess who it enriches? One certain person we can name. And I won't mention his name right here, but that's what happens up there. That to me is a good and bad thing. There was a time when alcohol was smuggled in, and I must confess I observed that. I didn't do it. I observed it. Okay. And I remember vividly watching whiskey bottles being thrown at our players on the bench in Baton Rouge, and our players had to wear a helmet on the bench because they could get crashed in the head by a full whiskey bottle. When you're throwing full bottles, that bothers me as a person who likes my bourbon. But I mean, my point is, this is the life we kind of had, and that drove people to make decisions about no sales. But then the money came along, and following the money, you end up saying, how can I maximize revenue? It's not just my revenue from the conference. It's also my revenue from tickets, my revenue from sponsorships. And by the way, those last two are connected in some respects to alcohol being available in the stadium, aren't they? You get more players. I mean, more people coming, more fans coming into the venue if you have alcohol for them to purchase. And you maximize your revenue. You have a chance to put some sponsorships up there. Look at our friends over in Kentucky. Woodford Reserve has a number of places you can buy their product throughout that entire stadium, and their name is plastered everywhere. They pay for that. So again, when you want to maximize your revenue here, it's not just a matter of your network, of your conference contracts with the TV folks. That's lucrative, but it's still a fraction of what a Texas A&M or a Texas or an Oklahoma bring in. I mean, the revenue we get in Texas A&M from the SEC is significant, but it's not even a majority of what we bring in. But you have a big stadium. You have clever people managing the sales of sponsorships, and guess what? It adds up. And alcohol is a part of that, and we're stuck with it. The best we can do is manage it to the point where we don't have major problems with it.
John, we saw that in advertising and in sponsorships throughout pro sports. Every scoreboard had Winston, and obviously there was the Winston Cup. Cigarettes go away, but with hard liquor, I went through this. Before I left the Magic, our postgame show was called Jack Daniel's Magic Rewind. That hard liquor then became part of radio and TV deals as well as in arena.
Yeah, I think again the industry when certain doors are closed, other doors open, and again there was always a prohibition on alcoholic beverages and particularly hard liquor. Then they got beer in, and then eventually they became spirits were allowed in, and so you couldn't run these ads until 9 o'clock. That's why the post game show back in the day, if you remember that, Andrew, became the Jack Daniels, because you could only run hard liquor ads after 9 o'clock. You could run beer ads all day long as you had a certain level percentage of responsible drinking ads, but hard liquor then came on and after 9 o'clock. So there were these rules that were put in place, and again, the industry always finds ways to take that money. But then again, at the same time, when you take that money, you have to act responsible too with that standpoint. And so again, I think to make the game viewing experience or the in-arena experience, to be complete with the home television and the home theater feeling, having alcoholic beverages served is one way to do that. So I don't think you're going to see that going away, but I do think again, we haven't seen any, I think, terrible situations yet where, fans have run amok. They usually stop serving at a certain point in time. I think the leagues and the teams do a pretty good job generally policing themselves in that space. But again, I think that revenue then became an important part of the overall continued to fuel that growth along with everything else. So, it's part and parcel of the world that we live in today. So I had one other topic for you, Andrew, too. You talked about the best deal in sports, that was up, the recent CBS SEC deal. Well, there's another one that's coming up here within the next 18 months. We're in that negotiating window, but that's all the NCAA championship rights outside of the men's basketball tournament. CFP's not included in that because that's football, but all the other NCAA championships are up. And ESPN's had those rights for the last 11 years and paid $500 million for it back in, I think, 2011. And, that averages out to about almost $40 million a year for all those other championship events. And now if you look at what's going on with those, and you look at women's basketball in particular, drawing 9 million viewers last year to their Final Four. There was a women's volleyball event on following a Fox NFL game the other day that eclipsed the record, 1.6 million viewers listening to that. But I think in the women's sports right now is certainly an area that's trending up. And if you look at those championships right now, what the NCAA is trying to ascertain is, do they take that out to the marketplace and look at breaking some of these up? There's been a report that if you just took the women's basketball tournament and you put it out on its own, it could generate close between $80 to $110 million alone versus all the other 29 championships out there. So it'll be interesting to see how the NCAA approaches this, because they've got a great partner with ESPN right now who really does a lot to promote those events in and around everything else that they do, between covering their highlights in Sports Center and promoting them in their NFL football games, et cetera. There's a tremendous intrinsic value attached to that doesn't necessarily show up in the rights fees. But if they could go out there and break those up and sell those things individually, would they get more money? But do they lose some of their promotional capabilities being on a network that amplifies collegiate sports so much as an ESPN does? So I think it's going to be fascinating to kind of watch where the NCAA's decision makers come in on this process. And do they want to take the more money, that they could probably generate if they unbundle it? Or do they try to keep the bundle and have, and does ESPN as the incumbent, pay an increase? But is it an increase that they could have generated more? Obviously, it's not too dissimilar to what the CBS SEC conversations went like, to see how that all turns out. But there are enough players in the marketplace now with the tonnage of those events, particularly streaming services, that could see value in that. So it'll be interesting to see how what path that the NCAA takes as they navigate and look at the different options for them to how to best monetize and still keep the promotional aspects going of those NCAA championship events.
It's fascinating now with streaming being a part of this, right? Amazon obviously jumps in because of Thursday Night Football. NBC and Peacock is now big with the Big Ten, so that's a player. And everybody who thought conference rights were going to go down, now that there's new players. And John, you know this, if there's something out there and there's an incumbent, all you need is the rumor of another network to drive up that price. But you make I think it's the fascinating part of not so much staying with what we know, but that cross promotion versus how much if NBC got this, CBS got this, Peacock got this, Amazon got this, Apple got this, all that, then is it more difficult for a fan to have to find it? Or do you trust that your fan of softball, women's basketball, men's soccer will find it because they're such a fan? It's going to be very interesting. And I'm with you. I think it's going to be very valuable.
Yeah, so again, the tonnage of that sport, there's over 2,000 live hours when it's all said and done. You have the full tournament, again, if the women's tournament expands, they also own the NITs. This is all championships, baseball, softball, all those ones that work up on all of the ancillary products that the early round playoff games that you've got. So there's a tremendous amount for a streamer to be able to take advantage of that process too, to put those games on out there as well. So again, and I think it's a very valuable commodity right now. We've seen the value of, again, what women's sports are in the landscape. Advertisers want to pay for women's sports right now. They're stepping up to the plate for that. So again, it's a great time to be the NCAA. I mean, with all the other areas where they may be getting lambasted right now, at least they've got this opportunity here to do to generate more revenue. But do they take revenue in terms of the promotional value that an ESPN delivers for them? And again, those are the things you just don't know yet. But does Peacock become very valuable and now promoting that? And over time, you forget that there wasn't even ESPN promoting that because Peacock may be doing a better job promoting. You just don't know yet. That's the future that you can't see yet. But there again, a lot of times these people they're taking the money. They do lose some value having that incumbent who did a very good job in partnering with them to grow those sports, not in terms of telling their story, but in certainly showcasing them on their most lucrative platforms.
Hey, John, I have a question for you right quick. You talked a while ago about the ABC ESPN relationship situation. What happens if Disney decides to shed one of their pieces? That's been rumored lately. How does that affect us in college sports? Can you predict that in any way?
Well, I think what ESPN is looking to do is find the right strategic partner that's going to help them navigate their world eventually to the direct-to-consumer model. I mean, they have been such a cash cow on the linear cable bundle model that they realize they're not going to be able to come close to those types of revenues. There was a recent report, maybe it's a month old now, that it broke out their financials from just ESPN separately versus what ESPN was. It was hard to tell what it was because they were all bundled in when they made the reports to the investors and the analysts. But now they broke the NBA out. And I want to say that it was still about 30, it was about a 30% margin that they were generating. And even in that, as a business, is a pretty good world. All right. But probably back in the days, if you're looking at ESPN, that margin was probably 50, 60%. So in their heyday, but now with cord cutting and all those things that are happening there, I think that's one of the industries getting maligned for that. But again, the challenge was the margins were so high. Now it's still a very good margin for business if you're looking at 30% margin. But is that margin going to grow, or is that margin still going to continue to shrink based where they are? So how quickly can they figure out what that direct-to-consumer model looks like? Because I don't know if they'll ever get back to a 50% margin, but that's going to be important to tell what's the direction that they're headed for. And at some point, again, we had talked in class today about this, that if you had to buy ESPN today, and we were talking about streaming service prices, roughly your Netflixes and movie channels, non-sports, are about $9. If you add, an RSN package right now to get your local team, those are somewhere in the neighborhood of $25 to $30 a month. You're talking about if you had all of the ESPN content, the NBA, the NFL, the baseball, every piece of their product, you put it on a direct consumer product, it's going to have to be somewhere between $25 and $35 a month to equate to where they are in the terms of generating revenue in their cable system. Will people pay that? Avid sports fans, not a problem. Where do I sign up and go?
I pay it.
The challenge where they're going to lose it is the people who just happen to follow into it, bump into it, and aren't avid fans, but to see it because it's available on ESPN and it's a place where they go. If all of a sudden now the volleyball ends up on a streaming service called Flow, you've got to really work hard to find that. All right. And so I think that becomes kind of part of that challenge of where do these events all end up. The smart people, will find it, but because there's so many choices right now, the fragmentation of that audience is going to decline. And I think, again, is ESPN, whoever's in that space, going to be able to recoup those dollars in some fashion or form, ideally through the streaming model? So today, the leader in the clubhouse, I would say, still probably ESPN, just because of the infrastructure that they built. But again, the Apples, the Amazons, the Netflixes of the world have a much larger war chest out there. If they want to invest that in sports, they're certainly capable of, and let's see what, if and when they do it, and what that model looks like. We've seen a little bit with Amazon on Thursday night. We've seen a little bit with Apple in their MLS deal. But I think, again, they're trying to figure out what their appetite's going to be and what their distribution flows are going to look like. And I think, again, you might see Apple or Amazon someday buy a broadcast network to make sure that they get the ample distribution that they need. So they could do it. They've got the money right now to do it. Fox, Rupert Murdoch, always sells at the best time. He may be looking at it right now and say, hey, I'm at probably the top of my game with what I've got on the Fox Broadcasting Network. I really don't have a streaming play. I've got a thing called Tubi out there. But again, their rights that they have are locked in for the long term. If someone wanted to purchase them, my guess is he would probably listen to see what that would look like. So those players could immediately jump in and buy a broadcast outlet and give them that amplification process they need to tell their story and where to tell those viewers to go sign up for these individual streaming services.
So every week is like this? Every podcast is like this? This is great.
We have fun.
Are you kidding me? This is awesome.
All about money, Andrew. All about money.
You know what? That's a really good title. Follow the money.
Yep. Dr.
Lofton, John, thank you. Appreciate it. Dalton Hughes, thank you as well. Our episode of Follow the Money. Until next time, I'm Andrew Monaco. So long, everybody.